Our next video lecture here for Unit 5, we're going to talk a little bit about some things that go on down deeper in the brain rather than up at the cerebral cortex. And so we're mainly going to be talking about the diencephalon section of the brain and then some surrounding areas. So your diencephalon, so you're learning about that over on the anatomy side, and it consists of three structures: the thalamus, hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus, you're going to hear about that all the time. We've already heard about it a little bit with body temperature regulation, but you'll hear a lot about the hypothalamus when you take Biology 202. And then there's an area called the epithalamus as well. This part of the brain encloses the third ventricle. That's a little thin, fluid-filled space that's right there in the inferior medial part of the brain itself. All right, so here is a sagittal section, a mid-sagittal section through the brain where you're cutting the brain open into two halves. And I have to caution you, sometimes these mid-sagittal sections, they're not all that good at giving you that 3D perspective of the brain. So it's really helpful to me that for understanding brain anatomy, if you use one of those 3D anatomy apps, since you guys probably don't have three-dimensional brain models sitting around your house for you to use, those 3D anatomy apps really come in handy in helping you understand how these different structures are oriented with each other. And so if we slice the brain in half, so your third ventricle is right in here. This is the fluid-filled space. Very thin, almost like if you put your hands together and you have that little bit of space in between. It's very thin and filled with fluid. And then the walls of that fluid-filled space down here in this lower anterior area, that's called the hypothalamus. Okay, so there are cell bodies of neurons that sit there in the walls around that fluid-filled space that function together as this area that we call the hypothalamus. And then the thalamus is these oval-shaped structures. You have one over on the right and one over on the left. Now, since we've cut this brain open in a mid-sagittal section, you're only seeing the one that is deeper inside the brain. And so there would be another one over here that has been cut out of our view. So that's where the thalamus is located. And then your epithalamus is over here in this section of the brain. And one of the key features there is the pineal gland, which produces some hormones involved in your sleep-wake cycle. So all those things that you see right in there, and again, you're just seeing a mid-sagittal section, so you're not getting a 3D perspective here at all. Those make up your diencephalon, because you got a left side and a right side of this. All right, the thalamus, 80% of the volume of the diencephalon consists of the thalamus. And the thalamus kind of looks like the ends of a golf club. And you got one over on the left, you got one over on the right. And so these portions right in here and right over in here make up some of the the upper lateral walls of the third ventricle. They are connected to each other. There's a little strip of tissue called the intermediate mass that links the two together. So if you imagine thalamus on the left side, thalamus over on the right side, there's a little strip of tissue in between. Contains several nuclei. Now, nuclei here is not being used like the nucleus of a cell. This is a different use of the term nuclei. Nucleus in the brain is a cluster of cell bodies. So there could be many gazillions of them sitting there, and those are called nuclei when they're not up here at the cortex. So they'll appear gray if you looked at actual brain tissue, because you've got a lot of cell body located there. Now, within the thalamus, probably the easiest thing to remember about the thalamus is the neuron cell bodies, the neurons that are located there, receive incoming signals. There are nerve fibers coming upward from the spinal cord, for example, that form synapses with the neurons in the thalamus. And then the thalamus takes that information and it sends appropriate action potentials to parts of the cerebral cortex that need that information. So the thalamus is kind of considered to be like a routing station for the brain. Also, there are parts of the thalamus that help decide whether or not you're going to be awakened when you're sleeping. You know, sleep is very important for your survival. So at night, the thalamus helps filter out non-dangerous senses that occur during the night while you're sleeping. You know, imagine if during the night every single little sound that occurred in your bedroom woke you up. You would never get any sleep. So the thalamus helps make some of those types of decisions. If you have a loud noise, then the thalamus is going to send action potentials up to the part of the cerebral cortex that need to perceive those sounds and potentially wake you up. So the thalamus makes those types of routing decisions. It's considered to be a gateway to your cerebral cortex. Sorts, edits, and relays information to where it needs to go. Afferent impulses, so upgoing impulses up to the cerebral cortex. Also involved, interestingly, in things like learning and memory. So many parts of the brain are very, very complex. All right, the hypothalamus, which is, kind of move over here on the map. So we've got a mid-sagittal section here through the brain, and this inferior but anterior section of the third ventricle in here. The third ventricle fluid-filled space is located right in there. And the walls of that area constitute the hypothalamus. So some of them are over on the right-hand side, and we get a wall over on the right-hand side, get a wall over on the left, and together those make up the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus does not really look like a bunch of jelly beans or candies from Candy Crush. What they're representing for you here, within the hypothalamus, you have clusters of neurons that have different names, and no, you do not have to learn all of these different names for those nuclei. These again are called nuclei because they're clusters of cell bodies, but they have different functions in different areas, and that's what they're trying to illustrate for you. The hypothalamus is connected to the pituitary gland. There's a little stalk there called the infundibulum, and when you guys take Biology 202 and learn about the endocrine system, that's gonna wind up being very, very important, that communication between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. All right, I think I talked about everything on that slide. Now hypothalamus has many different functions, like control of body temperature, control of the osmolarity of your body fluids. When you guys learn more about that in Biology 202, the hypothalamus will come up again. It helps regulate your solute concentrations in your body fluids. Olfactory relay stations, so dealing with that sense of smell and making sure that information gets to the right areas for interpretation. There are emotional areas within the hypothalamus as well. So lots and lots and lots of different functions occur in this area. Many of the hypothalamus functions are autonomic. So the hypothalamus is involved in things like controlling blood pressure, your heart rate, even your digestive tract, motility, how quickly you're moving things through the digestive tract. And as I just mentioned, there are nuclei within the hypothalamus, those clusters of cell bodies that are involved in some of your emotional responses, pleasure, fear, rage, all kinds of stuff, even your biological rhythms, your sleep-wake cycles, things like that. And let's see, I think I have already covered all this information. Hypothalamus controls release of hormones by the anterior pituitary. You're going to be tired of hearing about that when you take Biology 202. The hypothalamus itself actually makes some hormones that are secreted by the posterior section of the pituitary gland. And one of those hormones is actually the oxytocin that leads to contractions of the uterus when a woman is giving birth. But that information you guys are going to hear when you take Biology 202. All right, then the third area of the diencephalon is called the epithalamus. This is the most dorsal portion of the diencephalon. It actually forms the roof of the third ventricle. So let's see if we can go back to our picture over in here. So, over in this area, this is going to be your epithalamus back in it over in here. Epi means to lie over So it's the epithalamus lies over the thalamus, which is right in there in that area. Within the epithalamus, you do have an endocrine gland, a hormone secreting gland called the pineal gland. It makes a hormone called melatonin. You may have heard of that before. It helps regulate your sleep and wake cycles. So there are plants that actually produce melatonin for other functions as well. And so that melatonin from plants can get purified and put into little pills that you can buy as an herbal type drug at the drugstore. And some people take that to help them regulate their sleep-wake cycles properly. Okay, so outside the, or including parts of the diencephalon, there's an area of the brain called the limbic system. And so this area includes some structures on the medial aspects of the cerebral hemispheres. So if you think about your brain hemispheres, well, like if we were looking, if we made a coronal section, and over here we had right side of the brain, over here the left side of the brain, and then you've got that longitudinal fissure running right down the center. So medial aspects of the hemispheres would be over in here. So you've got cell bodies of neurons over in that area. And keep in mind this is a coronal section through the brain, so we're looking in 2D in this particular case. So there are neurons in that region on the left and the right side that are parts of your limbic system. And then there are also part of the diencephalon make up part of the limbic system as well. And then there are also some structures that wind up encircling the brainstem itself that are parts of this system. So it kind of extends across multiple areas. Then within this limbic system, there are different areas that are have different functions. So there again, these are clusters or groups of neurons that have particular jobs. Limbic system, probably the key thing to remember with this, emotions. This is an emotional center of the brain. And there's an area called the amygdala there, which is very involved for us being able to perceive facial expressions. You know, when you see somebody else's face, how do you know that they're angry? How do you know that they're in a state of fear? Things like that. That's important for human survival. Imagine if you couldn't, if somebody looked like a raging maniac, they were coming and getting ready to kill you, and you had no way of interpreting that, you would be more likely to get attacked. Or what if you couldn't notice, had no way of realizing that somebody else looked like they were in a state of panic or fearful of something? That might not be good for your survival either, because when somebody else is scared, there's probably a good reason for us to be scared as well. So the amygdala is involved in eliciting your fear response. And there's a section of the limbic system called the cingulate gyrus. It's like a deep gyrus or a little hill down deep in there with along in between the two hemispheres of the brain. And this is actually involved in helping us express our emotions via gestures, and also involved in resolving mental conflicts that we might have. You know, different parts of our brain have different interpretations, different impressions of things. The cingulate gyrus helps you resolve those types of discrepancies. Emotional responses to odor. So we already talked about how you have the olfactory association areas that help you identify what smells are. But within the limbic system, this is where you have emotional reactions to odors, like that stinks or that smells really good. You know, that's making me hungry. That food smell, I want to eat some of that. You know, those types of things come from the limbic system. This is a diagram from your textbook, and what they're doing, they're highlighting in red here some of these different structures that I just talked about. And no, you don't have to try to learn the names and locations of all of these different things here on the diagram. Just review the information that I covered here within this lecture. We're just trying to have a little overview of what's going on in these different parts of the brain. So these are all deeper structures within the brain, and you know, these kind of circular features like the cingulate gyrus here. That is a deeper gyrus. They're between the two hemispheres, and within that gyrus you have neurons that carry out these functions that we just went over. And here's the amygdala. We were just talking about the amygdala a minute ago, that little knot right in there. You have cell bodies of neurons that are involved in these types of emotional responses, recognizing angry or fearful expressions. So it's pretty amazing that people have actually worked these types of things out, and some of this information comes from probing around in those areas with people who are have volunteered for experiments, or people who have injuries to those types of areas within the brain. What types of functions do they lose? That's how a lot of this information has been worked out over time. Notice they're showing you here the olfactory bulb. This is your olfactory nerve. That's one of your, you have two of those. That's a left and a right. But that's the cranial nerve that's involved with your sense of smell, and so you can see how that is connected to some of these structures here down deep in the brain that are involved in our emotional responses. All right, that's kind of an overview of the diencephalon and some of those other deeper areas within the brain. The next video lecture, we're going to talk a little bit more about what goes on in the brainstem and the three different parts of the brainstem, and then also the cerebellum.